Does retro gaming have to be expensive? Does life have to be difficult? Do I have to do the Macarena every time I know I'm about to eat pizza? Well, in each of these cases, the answer is no, but it sure is likely. As much as gaming has a reputation for being expensive, it does at least have options that exist within it to make it cheaper. And, here's the key part, while still retaining most, if not all, of what makes it enjoyable. Something that certainly can't be said for every hobby. Ever heard of shark diving on the cheap? When it comes to gaming, perhaps the biggest factor that's going to determine how expensive things get is whether you're a collector or not. And when it comes to being a collector, there's a pretty wide range you can fall into, being anywhere from, yeah, I've picked up a handful of games over the years, to, well, the good news is at least I don't have to worry about getting new carpet. I think the biggest thing that makes collecting expensive is hunting down individual games. When you need a physical copy of each game you want to play, it can be asking a lot, especially if there's a lot of games you want. If you're adamant about having individual copies of games but still want to save money, one of the most popular routes people go is with imports. In some cases, games can cost a fraction of the price by purchasing a version from a different region. Although, this is like retro gaming's worst kept secret at this point, and not all imports are as cheap as others. If you really want to start saving, one of the quickest ways to do this is by eliminating the need to collect individual games, often by having something where you can just load all of the games onto it, like a Raspberry Pi, but it could even just be something like the computer that you already have. And while some will say this is unethical, others will say, who cares? Although there are officially licensed products that give you a whole bunch of games right out of the box. So if it's something that would weigh on your conscience and you want to do old Jiminy Cricket proud, that is an option for you. And luckily, many consoles are priced pretty cheap. That is, until you're forced to buy them on the secondhand market. Darn it. Even still, they could end up saving you money in the long run. But here's the thing, just because a cheaper option exists doesn't mean everybody is going to want it. You think the sad excuses for water guns they have these days are going to do the job for me? While the mini consoles are completely sufficient for many folks, they still don't make everybody happy. I mean, when does anything ever make everybody happy? But the reasons people have can vary. Something about the emulation feels off, they can notice input delay, or maybe they just got so pissed off constantly checking the now in stock website during the initial release that they swore them off entirely. But in most cases, the people who have issues with the mini consoles will tell you that they're lacking in authenticity somehow, or that the performance isn't up to snuff in some way or another. For those folks, there are options even outside of original hardware. What many will say does the trick is devices that use FPGA, which, while not original hardware, are designed to replicate original hardware and behave as they would. Which is pretty incredible to think about. Imagine if people could be programmed to replicate the exact behavior of dogs. And you might be thinking, wait a second, how is FPGA any different than emulation? Well, you could really get into the weeds on this one, but the simple explanation is that it tends to be, what many consider, a more accurate form of emulation, due to how it attempts to replicate the behavior of the original hardware itself. And because I know you're probably wondering, FPGA stands for Fantabulous Person's Gaming Arsenal, or something like that. However, this kind of trickery still comes at a price. The FPGA consoles made by Analog, as good as they are, still aren't cheap, and while most people would say they're a good value, it's still not what most people would consider inexpensive, especially if you have to go to the second-hand market to buy them for way more than they cost originally. Barf. And you still need to get games for it, even if most people getting one probably already had a collection of games. Really, I'd say that Analog products are more so a well-done solution for playing your consoles on more modern displays than they are a way to save money. Although, because they require games, you could always just get a multi-cart too, which come in a wide variety and a very popular option for any setup where you want to skip the collecting individual games part. A huge money saver. Okay, but what about Mr.? No, not what I was called when I got in trouble as a child. Mr. Gosh, that still triggers me. But I'm talking about Mr. as in the device that can play multiple consoles via FPGA. And it's certainly well liked, but it still costs quite a bit. And yet, again, people would say it's worth it because of how much it can do and how much it would cost to purchase everything it can do separately. It's your classic all-in-one type of solution. Because here's the thing, as much as having to buy multiple games can get things expensive in a hurry, having lots of consoles is arguably just as big of a factor. Because you know what more consoles means? That's right, more games for those consoles. If you think collecting for a single console can be expensive, try doing it for multiple consoles, which most people in the hobby tend to do. Because if you like Sega Genesis, then why not Sega Saturn? And then why not 10 more consoles to collect for? Whoa, they really start to add up, don't they? I also think there's something to be said about choosing to engage in a hobby in the most obvious way to do it. Most people's first thought when it comes to playing old games and consoles is to obtain those actual old games and consoles. It's how we were introduced to these things, and there's an emotional attachment we have to it, whether we owned it back in the day or not. My Sega Saturn feels like the long-lost brother I never had. That's not to say there aren't some far less emotional reasons for liking the Saturn, like, I don't know, being a good console that has some good games, but even considering all of this, the point remains that it's not the only option. What makes the hobby of retro gaming unique is that we are intentionally playing games from the past that are no longer produced, for the most part. And with this, the hobby has evolved in large part due to enthusiasts who constantly come up with ways to give us more ways to play and improve the ways that we do. Doesn't mean the original methods should be thrown in the trash, they just deserve to have some buddies. My Genesis, NES, and their minis do a bingo night every Tuesday. The goal is to have more options overall that can hopefully please as many people as possible, while still bearing in mind budgets, personal preferences, how invested somebody is, so on and so forth. I would hate for somebody to see the expensive options, get freaked out, and choose not to engage with the hobby at all as a result. I think there's something for everybody who's interested, and you don't need to have a ton of it to enjoy it, which, yeah, can be easier said than done, but even still. But speaking of having a ton of games, I also want to address the fact that a lot of the people who would say retro gaming can be expensive are people who have already been in the hobby for a while, understandably so. What I think we sometimes forget is that we don't have to keep buying games. And if you're not buying games, well, that's not very expensive, is it? Or, even just not buying as many games. For some of us, it may seem like we just keep adding games to our collections because, well, that's what we've done for so long. Now, I understand that not everybody is going to be into buying less games, especially if there's still a lot of games you want, but I find it to be a good reminder. Sometimes it's helpful to take a step back and appreciate what you already have, whether you're playing it or not, rather than focus so much on how unobtainable some of the games we don't have are. And believe me, there's always going to be something out of your price range. That being said, I certainly wouldn't want to bring any element of shame to those who do own expensive games. At the time they bought it, maybe it wasn't so expensive, and even if it was, maybe they spent months saving up for it, or sold off a bunch of stuff in order to pay for it. There's been a few times that I wanted to buy a game and found myself frantically trying to scrounge up whatever I could sell to pay for it. We can't just assume that every person who owns games that are expensive now just have pockets full of cash. Also, I want to talk about how some people may not choose some of the cheaper options I've mentioned in this video simply because they feel they require too much hassle to configure. I can't tell you how many times I have heard things like, just get a Raspberry Pi, just get a Mister, just get a Life, although admittedly that last one isn't gaming related. But it's not easy for everybody to figure out how to use these things, to which you might be thinking, come on, it's so easy for me. Well, pretty much anything is easy for somebody. Imagine if you were about to take off in an airplane and the pilot said, all right, folks, this is going to be really difficult for me. But for the money you'd save, I do believe most people could figure it out. It's just important to remember that it intimidates some people more than others. Alright, but to answer the question of does retro gaming have to be expensive, I think we first need to ask the question, what does retro gaming need to be for you personally? Depending what that is, the answer could be yes or no based on what it is you want, and heck, for some people, what they want is just for it to not be expensive. And lucky for those folks, that is an option. But with all of that said, I thought it would be fun for this video's question to ask you what your favorite trick is for keeping the hobby less expensive. And maybe it's not even a trick, it's just something pretty straightforward. So for those answers and anything else you'd like to say, leave your comment and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah. And he's talking about video games. He's